Good evening, good evening. I'm Toni Marks, I'm the president of the New York Public Library, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this important discussion this evening. We are in the middle not only of UN Week here in New York, but of banned book weeks across the nation. If you're not familiar, this is a week in which we gather the entire book community, librarians, booksellers, publishers, journalists, teachers, readers of all types, authors, in support of the key freedom to seek and express ideas openly. That simple notion, that American notion, has been under unprecedented assault in recent years. Just this week, PEN America, our partners on tonight's event, reported that 2,500 books, that's 2,500 titles, were banned in some 140 school districts in 32 states during 2021 to 22. Now, there's nothing new, I suppose, about this. We've been having banned book weeks for 40 years. I suppose that tells you nothing is new. I certainly feel that personally. My parents, German Jews, fled Germany in the 1930s, and the key signal for them of what was coming was the banning and burning of books. Fast forward, I lived in South Africa in the 1980s in the middle of a civil war against apartheid and experienced what it meant to have your newspaper show up completely blacked out. Books banned, authors banned. In fact, Aubrey, I remember getting to South Africa, not understanding fully this, and carrying literature in my bag that had a 6-year mandatory jail sentence for possession. It didn't occur to me, though it should have, that that could be the case. So here we are on this important topic in this important week. And we're here at the New York Public Library because we are dedicated, absolutely, to the free and open access of information and knowledge, and directly opposed to censorship, because we understand, as my colleagues tonight will say more eloquently than I can, this is the foundation of democracy, of liberty, of self-knowledge and respect. So we're doubling down. You know that so many libraries, the Brooklyn Public Library, others, been doing amazing, innovative things. We unbanned a set of books earlier in the year. Nationally, now for this week, we're coming out extra strong with book lists, giveaways, programs, and more. We're putting a particular spotlight on the work and legacy of our dear departed trustee and friend and the amazing author, Toni Morrison. And in fact, there'll be a reading at Schomburg tomorrow night of Toni's books because they are being banned. 2 of her classics, which are frequently banned, will be available for unlimited checkouts. Anybody, anytime, as much as you want on our e-reader, simply E, through the end of October. And of course, one of the treats tonight is the spectacular André sharing a passage from one of those books tonight. I should say, no, don't waste your time with applause. André is, of course, a star of the cast of the new Death of a Salesman, so it's curtain time very shortly, so we're going to make this work, and it's amazing that it's not amazing, it's a tribute to him that he understood the power of this and his power to help draw attention. So we're so grateful that he could be here. And of course, we're so honored to do tonight together with PEN America, which for over 100 years has been protecting free expression in the United States and worldwide. Tonight's event is part of their series, Flashpoints, Free Speech in American History, Culture, and Society. You can learn more by going online to pen.org/flashpoints. Finally, I'd like to thank and acknowledge the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos for making Live from NYPL, of which this program is a part, possible. At the end of the conversation, we'll have time for some questions. You have note cards and little pencils, I think, at your seats. There's staff members, colleagues will come around and get those. If you're watching online, please put your questions on chat. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jonathan Friedman, Penn's Director of Free Expression and Education Programs.
Hello, welcome, good evening to Restricted Access, the American History of Book Banning. My name is Jonathan Friedman, and I am the Director of Free Expression and Education at PEN America. PEN America, for those who don't know, stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression in the United States and worldwide. We are a 100-year-old organization that champions the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. Our mission is to unite writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the civil liberties that make it possible. Our strength is our membership, a nationwide community of novelists, journalists, translators, nonfiction writers, editors, poets, essayists, playwrights, publishers, scholars, and other writing professionals, as well as devoted readers and supporters who join with them to carry out our mission. You can find more about us, our events, our advocacy efforts, and joining PEN America at pen.org. Tonight's event is part of a year-long series around the country entitled Flashpoints, Free Speech in American History, Culture, and Society. The series is presented by PEN America in partnership with the American Historical Association with a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Special thanks to our partners tonight, the New York Public Library, for co-presenting and hosting this event. Tonight, we are also marking the 100th anniversary of PEN America, and in addition to live events, digital resources from the Flashpoint series will be available online for years to come. It is also, of course, Banned Books Week, the 40th anniversary of Banned Books Week, part of a nationwide celebration of the freedom to read. As we'll hear tonight, censorship is not new in American history or society, but today we're living through something special. This is an unprecedented flare-up. Books are being yanked from schools almost daily, and books, not just any books, books about LGBTQ stories, about race and racism, books about gender, books that question American history, books that contain sometimes any reference to any sexuality whatsoever. And they are being targeted all over in 32 states. What's new today about this, then, is not book banning itself, but that this isn't isolated, it's a pattern, and it's a growing movement. The same kinds of books targeted through the same tactics by an explosive number of groups operating nationally, regionally, locally, some with extremist or political aims, much of it coordinated online through the circulation of books and directed actions at school boards, at public libraries. And it's not just book bans either. There is a wave beyond the book bans of educational censorship taking place as well that we at Penn call the Ed Scare. It parallels the Red Scare, but then it was about communism and schools and institutions, and today it's a roving target. It started with the 1619 Project, it continued with divisive concepts and critical race theory, and is now targeting LGBTQ education and identities almost daily. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. As a result, we are not just seeing bans on books, but bans on curriculum, bans on stickers, bans on flags, bans on rainbow-themed clothing, bans on buses going to plays in Miami-Dade to see a play by Pulitzer-winning play by Nilo Cruz. The movement began in schools, but it is far from focused on them only, as you see it is spreading to other public institutions. Please, I invite all of you here tonight and watching online to join us at pen.org and join our fight against book banning and our campaign to free the books. We're thrilled you're all able to be here tonight for what I know will be an engaging and robust conversation about American democratic history. We are grateful to have here tonight our moderator, Ali Velshi, and panelists Laurie Halse Anderson, Farah, Jasmine, Griffin, Whitney, Strub, and Amy Werbel. I also have the distinct honor of introducing actor and activist André DeShields. In a career spanning more than half a century, Mr. DeShields has acquired a number of sobriquets, among them the Broadway deity, professional charmer, and Papa Dre. He was the Triple Crown winner of the 2019 awards season, garnering Toni, Outer Critics Circle, Drama Desk, and Grammy Awards for Best Featured Actor in a Musical for his universally praised roles as Hermes, Messenger to the Gods in Hadestown. Please join me in welcoming Mr. DeShields, who will begin our night with a reading from Toni Morrison. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Critical Race Theory. That isn't true. Welcome to all of the poets, essayists, novelists, and all lovers of banned literature. Thank you.
Damn. I do this banned book club every week, in which Beloved was one of the books, but whenever we do it, some of it's about the author, and some of it is about the book, and some of it is about the idea, but I always obviously read excerpts. They don't sound like that when I do it. I'm going to see if Andre's available for helping me with that. That was a great and amazing start to it, not just because of Beloved and the literature, because Beloved is everything about banned books, right? It's uncomfortable. It makes you uncomfortable. It's a heavy lift. It's not a casual read, but it is that book. It is that book that is about ideas. It is about the writing. It is about the language that causes the discomfort that causes us to be here tonight. We talked about the 1619 Project. I remember some years ago someone recommending that I read this. It had come along on my feed, but someone said I should read this and I should talk to Nicole Hannah-Jones. And Nicole and I sort of knew each other from Twitter, and our exchanges weren't always that nice. We found reason to be critical of each other, which is fine. But I read the 1619 Project, and I called her on the show, and my overwhelming thought was, thank you for writing this thing that I didn't know. First of all, absolutely, I just didn't know the facts behind what she was writing. And thank you for introducing me to an idea about something so seminal and central to our history in America, and our foundational myths and ideas that I hadn't thought about. And that none of it was an acknowledgement that I agreed with her or that she was right. It was that she opened my mind to something I would not have stumbled upon myself and I would not have known. And she and I have become allies to the extent that when I launched the Banned Book Club, she was the first person I spoke to on TV about it, and she was actually the catalyst for doing this on cable TV, which is unusual, by the way, for cable TV, because and we'll talk about it very shortly, it's not just political. It's actually outside of politics. It's been going on forever from all quarters. I remember on my first banned book club, I brought the William Tyndale Bible to remind people that making the Bible accessible through mass printing, and in that particular case in English, was the worst thing that could have happened to the church. It was the most threatening thing that ever happened. The idea that people could read the Bible or any religious text or any interpretations and come up with their own versions of it was kind of remarkable. All of this is a very long way to say thank you for being here tonight. To those of you watching online, thank you. You are all foot soldiers in this effort, and this effort is now fundamentally about democracy. And thank you to my guests tonight. We're going to have a remarkable conversation. They are all, in different and specific ways, experts on this. Laurie has been a guest. She has been a featured guest on the Velshi Band Book Club. And I look forward to a robust conversation, including for your questions. By the way, I'm Ali Velshi. I didn't mention that at the beginning. Thank you. It's an honor to be with you. Thank you to Penn. Thank you to the library. Let me start with Dr. Amy Werbel, who is sitting next to me. Dr. Werbel is a specialist in the, by the way, these people are so accomplished, like normally I just kind of wing this stuff, but I'm actually reading it because they have such a list of things that they've done. And this is a highly curated short list of what they have done. Dr. Werbel is a specialist in the art of the United States, of the United States at the Fashion Institute of Technology. She's the author of Lust on Trial, Censorship and the Rise of American Obscenity in the Age of Anthony Comstock, which won the 2019 Peter C. Rowlands Book Prize. She's also the recipient of fellowships and scholarships from numerous institutions, including the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and she served as a Fulbright Scholar. Dr. Werbel, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure and honor. And I want to echo the thanks to PEN America, New York Public Library, American Historical Association. I am the historian on this panel, and I'm going to take us back to the beginning. I'm thinking I should add a little bit of theatrical drama following that amazing reading, but I'm not sure I'm quite up to it. On this day, 107 years ago, September 21st, 1915, Anthony Comstock died. The United States' first professional and still to this date most successful book burner was safely interred in history's dustbin. Despite his extraordinary influence on culture and law in the United States, obituaries in major newspapers did not extol Comstock's victories nor mourn his passing. The New York Times editor's derision was palpable. Quote, "The fact that blanks occur in the translated pages of Zola, of Boccaccio, and of many modern and ancient classics is due to Mr. Comstock," end quote. Nobody came to the defense of such putative victories. Even Comstock's staunchest supporters were tired of a campaign that was an obvious failure and a public relations disaster. Anthony Comstock might defensibly have been lauded as an archetypal American success story, someone who punched far above expectations based on his origins. He was born in New Canaan, Connecticut in 1844 and reared in an evangelical Christian family plagued by death and bankruptcy. Following service in the Civil War, Comstock came here ambitiously and naively, determined to purify the nation's most obviously impure city, acting as a self-enlisted soldier of Christ. He moved into a boarding house near City Hall, close to the heart of the nation's publishing industry, and began conducting amateur investigations of erotic book publishers. To Comstock's disgust, the police were utterly uninterested in aiding his cause, but he was able to secure backing from wealthy Christian industrialists who created a private organization to support his efforts, the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. These evangelical elites then sent Comstock to Washington, D.C., where he successfully lobbied for the nation's first federal anti-obscenity law in 1873, and many subsequent state laws thereafter. This legislation made birth control, abortion, and various forms of sexual expression, including many books, illegal in the United States for the first time. The intent of the so-called Comstock laws was avowedly theological. A sympathetic view is that Comstock and his supporters earnestly endeavored to save souls from the fires of hell by preventing arousal that would lead to sexual sin. A more clear-eyed description is of a Christian nationalist agenda devoted to the proposition that government must enforce their understanding of God's laws and hierarchies, thus ensuring dominion for white Christian men in the United States. Books were pernicious threats to this power structure when they critiqued oppressive norms and portrayed multifaceted possibilities for faith, love, pleasure, and power. The variety and creativity in sexual expression that we see today was also evident in Comstock's era, and especially so in the titles of the 1,241 different books that were incinerated at his behest, totaling more than 106,000 pounds of paper and cardboard. The failure of this effort to erase our sexual diversity was especially evident 107 years ago, when a growing number of writers and artists were inventing rebellious proof that sexual variation could not be legislated or policed out of existence, whether despite of or because of the threat of incinerators. The New York Times was not coy in juxtaposing the material evidence of Comstock's success, the blotted words in Zola and Boccaccio, with acknowledgement as well of the ample ridicule he had endured, which had eroded his authority over time. Comstock's prosecution of Mrs. Warren's profession was particularly memorable in this regard. The title of George Bernard Shaw's controversial play refers to the main character's occupation as prostitute and brothel madam, subjects deemed the very definition of pornography. When the play was first scheduled to be performed in New York in 1905, Comstock instigated prosecutions of the actor Arthur Daly and the theater manager, Samuel Gompertz. Shaw, reading these reports across the Atlantic in Ireland, also caught wind of a rumor that librarians here at the New York Public Library had removed the play script from circulation. This incensed him, and he promptly fired back a widely publicized response. Quote, "Nobody outside of America is likely to be in the least surprised. Comstockery is the world's standing joke at the expense of the United States," end quote. The term Comstockery stuck, and thenceforth it was an efficient rhetorical takedown of the aging censor and his cause. 10 years after Shaw's influential Barb, the full weight of decades of ridicule were brought to bear during another well-publicized trial, in this case, Comstock's prosecution of William Sanger for circulating a copy of his wife Margaret's pamphlet, Family Limitations. Margaret Sanger started her career as a public health nurse working in immigrant communities in Lower Manhattan. Desperate patients, often sick due to malnourishment, disease, and amateur abortions, asked her how they could prevent pregnancy. In response, she wrote Family Limitations, which described methods of birth control. Comstock quickly indicted her for circulating obscenity, and she fled to Europe, leaving fellow activists to covertly distribute the 100,000 copies she had printed. Hoping to force Margaret to return, Comstock sent an agent pretending to be a compatriot to her husband's apartment. After William Sanger produced a copy of the pamphlet, he was subsequently arrested for circulating obscenity. But Comstock's strategy backfired spectacularly. Disparate activists organized together for the defense, and funds poured in. Comstock was desperate to end the fiasco and offered Sanger a suspended sentence on multiple occasions. But he chose jail instead, proclaiming, quote, "that in every real sense it is the law and not I that is on trial here today. I deny the right of the state to exercise dominion over the souls and bodies of our women by compelling them to go into unwilling motherhood. I deny the right of the state to arm an ignorant, irresponsible, and prudish censorship with the right of search and confiscation to pass judgment on our art and literature, and I deny as well to hold over the entire medical profession the legal ban of this obscenity statute," end quote. On the day after William Sanger's courageous, prescient, and well-publicized declaration, Comstock was reported too ill to leave his bed. He died 4 days later, an unloved anachronism finally laid to rest. An outpouring of public support enabled Margaret Sanger to return home and open America's first birth control clinic in Brownsville, Brooklyn in 1916. It didn't last long, but soon she helped found Planned Parenthood, which did last, along with myriad other organizations formed within the next decade to resist censorship, including the American Civil Liberties Union, American Association of University Professors, and of course, PEN America, which celebrates a century of resistance to Comstockery this year. We unfortunately must reckon once again with a new crop of Anthony Comstocks. If past is prologue, we can safely guess who will be remembered as courageous and cautionary 107 years from now. Thank you.
That was tremendous. Thank you, Dr. Werbel. I'm going to come back to you after we've heard from our other panelists, but thank you for that. Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin, thank you for being here, is the William B. Ransford Professor of English, Comparative Literature, and African American Studies at Columbia University, where she also served as the inaugural chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies. Professor Griffin is the author and editor of 8 books, including Who Set You Flowin', the African American Migration Narrative, If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday, and Harlem Nocturne, Women Artists and Progressive Politics During World War II. Dr. Griffin, thank you for being here. I want to go back to Andre's reading and Beloved. You have written that banning books such as Toni Morrison's Beloved undermines democracy. I'd love for you to expand on this because that's the basis of why I started the Banned Book Club. What's the history and context around the banning of Toni Morrison's works, and tell me how that extends to actually threatening democracy?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to join my fellow panelists. And thank you all for being here tonight. I think that, the efforts to ban Morrison, she's been banned, it seems, since she started publishing in 1970, for reasons that we would expect. That her books are uncomfortable. They raise uncomfortable truths. They happen to do it in very beautiful and seductive and compelling language so that you don't put the book down. You have to confront what it is that she's writing about. But they're truths that emerge out of our history. And they're parts of our history that all too often many people don't want to explore. They want to silence. And they especially want to silence them for young people. So I'll just step back a little bit. Morrison was acutely aware that she emerged out of a literary tradition, a Western literary tradition, where censorship is as much a part of the history as publication is, but in the context of the United States, out of a literary tradition of works by African American writers, people who, in some parts of this nation, were, it was illegal for them to read. It was illegal for them to write. It was illegal for people who weren't African American to teach them to read and write. And yet they wrote more than any enslaved society in the history of humankind. And they wrote and they bore witness in their writing to what their experiences were and the experiences of those less fortunate than the people who had access to the pen. Those books from the beginning, those pamphlets from the beginning, were banned. David Walker's Appeal was considered seditious, published in the 1830s. It was banned throughout the South, and sailors would sew copies of it in their coats, in the linings of their coats, to distribute it. So Morrison was well aware that she was part of this history. Bluest Eye was banned for being obscene because it talked about incest. Beloved has been banned. Paradise was banned because they said it might cause riots, incite riots in Texas prisons, and she actually enjoyed that banning. She thought that suggested to her, or didn't suggest, but asserted the power of language and the power of literature. And the last thing I'll say in response to your question is that she was always not only one of our greatest writers, but an advocate for writers, a fierce fighter against censorship. And I strongly encourage you to get a publication published by PEN, the organization that's sponsoring us, called Burn This Book. There's an opening essay by Toni called Peril, which is also the opening essay of her collection of essays, The Source of Self-Regard, where she talks about authoritarian regimes and how authoritarian regimes are often foolish, but none are foolish enough, she says, to let writers roam free and write what they think. And she talks about the peril to our society if we allow that to triumph. The peril to us as democratic societies, as people who love freedom, who would allow that to happen anywhere, that it is our obligation to defend the right of writers to write what they have to write. And then she ends that essay beautifully, but in a very frightening way. Imagine a world where we don't have plays, where we don't have poetry, where we don't have literature, we don't have art, that's the world, right? That banning books and the kinds of censorship that we find ourselves up against, that's what that world leads to. And it's often done out of fear, out of manipulating genuine fears that people have, rather than doing what literature allows us to do, is actually to read it, confront it, and to do the most democratic thing, to talk about it together, openly, as informed citizens.
Your comment that about enslaved people writing so much reminded me of the fact that some years ago when the Iran nuclear deal was being done, I was in Tehran. And it was very busy, and it was very hot, and it was the summer, and it was Ramadan, and I lost like 10 pounds because you can eat if you're a traveler, but it's a capital crime to eat in front of anybody who's fasting, so like it wasn't a risk I was taking. And one night, somebody said to me, there's sort of an underground art exhibit, and why don't you go to it? And I thought, what can an underground art exhibit in Tehran be? But somebody convinced me to go, and I attended, and I was fascinated by what it was and how rich it was. And I remember asking one of the artists, how does this flourish here in this closed society? And they said it flourishes because of this closed society. You are not going to turn off human expression no matter how hard you try. And it was perhaps one of the most eye-opening experiences I've ever had. Thank you so much, Dr. Griffin. Dr. Whitney Strub. I actually made a point of getting that right, is an associate professor at Rutgers University and the author of several books, including Perversion for Profit, The Politics of Pornography and the Rise of the New Right, and Obscenity Rules, Roth versus United States and the Long Struggle Over Sexual Expression. He also recently co-edited Porno Chic and the Sex Wars, American Sexual Representation in the 1970s with the scholar Carolyn Bronstein. Dr. Strub, thank you for being here tonight. And while my journey into banned books came through politics and 1619 and even Toni Morrison, what I was surprised at is as I sought out younger writers and first-time writers, it was all prudishness, it was all sex, it was all the queer experience that was being banned and people didn't want their children to have exposure to, particularly if it involved, and we're going to talk about this a little later, sexual assault. Many of the recent book banning campaigns at the local level have targeted novels with queer characters and themes, and these efforts might seem new to the general public. They have a very long history in American legal, political, and cultural history. You've written about American obscenity laws and sexual expression. Talk to me a bit about that and the connection to LGBTQ literature and text.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's such an honor to be here, especially for a cause that I'm so personally, politically committed to, namely anti-censorship work. Yeah, and I think the history of obscenity law as a sort of tool of what we might call heteronormativity, or a system of heterosexual supremacy, is really deeply interwoven with exactly the sort of history of white supremacist censorship that Farah's talking about. I mean, it's always, when we see the books that are being banned today, it's always Lawn Boy and genderqueer mixed with Beloved and The Hate You Give. These two factors are inseparable threads, but to speak particularly to the sort of sexual politics of obscenity, Yeah, like you suggested, I mean, this is nothing new. And I think for folks in the room, probably many of us here have a lived memory of earlier iterations of these exact same political causes, right? Whether it's Heather Has Two Mommies in the 1990s, or, the insidious rhetoric that's used today of groomers against teachers and librarians, that earlier manifested in Anita Bryant's Save Our Children crusade in the 1970s, or Jerry Falwell in The Moral Majority in the 1980s. But historically speaking, we can push, much further back. What we really see is that anti-queer animus or hostility has been a motivating cause of censorship in America for, well over a century. I mean, just to take one somewhat arbitrary starting point, I mean, if we look at the 1920s, we're going to see customs officials trying to prevent the importation of Radcliffe Hall's pioneering lesbian novel, The Well of Loneliness. Right around that same time, the next year in 1927, Eve Adams, who's a pioneering kind of lesbian kind of architect of community down in the Village here in New York City, she's going to be deported partly on the grounds of indecent literature for publishing her collection of stories and poetry, Lesbian Loves. She'll die in Auschwitz because she was deported. And so, you can see already the sort of perniciousness of this history. And by the time lesbian pulp fiction emerges as a popular genre in the 1950s, that's been so internalized that the authors of those books will generally end the stories. If anybody's read, some of the famous titles like Spring Fire, Twilight Girl, the Bebo Brinker series, which is a rare exception in some ways, but generally speaking, lesbian novels in the 50s will end with either tragedy, often suicide, or a sudden discovery of heterosexuality, all because, this need to avoid obscenity charges has been so internalized into the very production of this literature. And just to carry it out through a few more examples before saying a quick word about obscenity doctrine, by the time you reach the Cold War, for instance, in Los Angeles, there's an all-out war on gay male expression. And so physique magazines, for instance, something like Physique Pictorial, which is published by Bob Mizer, is almost exactly contemporaneous with Playboy. But Playboy is never hit with obscenity charges. It fits a sort of normative logic of airbrushed women presented for the consumption of the male gaze, whereas Physique Pictorial, which is actually generally less explicit in its pictures of scantily clad men kind of posing athletically, gets repeatedly charged with obscenity in Los Angeles, to the point that its publisher basically takes a more timid approach to his images because he's afraid of going to jail. During that same era, going into the 50s and 60s, avant-garde and experimental queer cinema is constantly prosecuted, whether it's Flaming Creatures here in New York City, Jack Smith's quite transgressive film, or Kenneth Anger's movies Fireworks with its, I don't know if people have seen Fireworks. If you haven't, you absolutely should. It's only 15 minutes long and easy to find online, and it's got a climactic scene of a man unzipping his fly and a firecracker pops out. A very obvious phallic symbol, but not explicitly sexual. That winds up prosecuted for obscenity in Los Angeles, and so does Anger's follow-up, Scorpio Rising, another iconic underground film. It gets to the point that even a homophile magazine, and the early gay and lesbian rights movement called itself the homophile movement, and one of the early magazines was called One. No images, nothing salacious, nothing pornographic, but it was still prosecuted as obscene by postal officials and banned from the mail. This is into 1958, 1959 now we're talking. And it's actually going to challenge that all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I think it's worth noting that the two first LGBTQ legal victories in the Supreme Court were both obscenity cases. One v. Olison, the case I just mentioned, in 1959, and then Manual Enterprises v. Day about physique magazines in 1962. And so, again, and this is just scratching the surface of this century-plus history, but you can see the pervasive and repetitive deployment of obscenity charges against queer expression of all sorts. From pornographic to completely, kind of banal political expression, which leads in, I think, to the one other point I want to make, which is just that it's easy to imagine that as a sort of bug of the system rather than a feature of it. But as an historian of obscenity law, I would say that fundamentally the legal understanding of obscenity that we have in this country is geared toward attacking sexual nonconformity of various stripes, but particularly queer expression. And that's really obvious if you look at the landmark case. So picking up kind of from where Amy left off, after Comstock dies, the 1873 law passed in his name hasn't been challenged, hasn't reached the Supreme Court in decades. It's not going to be until 1957 that the Supreme Court will hear a meaningful obscenity case in the 20th century. It's a case called Roth versus United States. A local publisher here, Samuel Roth, who is frequently in trouble with the law, really fascinating character. But he takes an obscenity case to the Supreme Court, which rules against him in a split decision. It affirms his conviction. But Justice William Brennan tries to modernize obscenity law, kind of make it more liberal, and the standard that he comes up with, which is, to this day, with a little bit of modification, the fundamental bedrock of obscenity doctrine at the legal level, is that to the average person applying contemporary community standards, the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. And it doesn't take a whole lot of deconstruction to understand that every one of those standards is rigged toward a sort of majoritarian rule. And so who's the average person to the Supreme Court in 1957? Obviously a straight white man, right? I mean, that's the presumptive kind of legal fiction of the average person. You know, what are contemporary community standards? Well, they're obviously extraordinarily homophobic and very heteronormative. And what do they mean by prurient interest? Well, in a footnote, Brennan tries to define it with the dictionary, and basically it's a list of synonyms, which I think are itching, lascivious, morbid, and lewd. And again, all of these are sort of screaming dog whistles for sort of queer sexuality. You know, again, naked Marilyn Monroe in Playboy doesn't fit that at all. That's not itching or lascivious, that's normal. But so anyway, yeah, I mean, the system is fundamentally rigged against queer expression in ways that really linger. And the very last thing I'll say is that I think, you know, all of these obscenity cases are obviously quite destructive and pernicious, both to the people involved in them and to our culture. But to my mind, the sort of apex of that, the most destructive legacy of that, comes in the 1980s when Republican Senator Jesse Helms pioneers a new attack on both the arts and sex education. First attacking the National Endowment for the Arts, claiming that homoerotic expression is inherently obscene, but then taking that model, that framework, and applying it to the CDC. And so at the height of the AIDS crisis, into the years of the highest fatalities of the AIDS crisis, because of Jesse Helms and his understanding that homoeroticism is obscene, the CDC is prevented from funding safer sex education materials that work, which are graphic, explicit, gay positive, and sex positive. And it can't do that. I mean, people literally die, by the thousands because of the legacy of this. And so, if there's any message that I as an historian can convey, it's simply that we really need to push back, not just against the case level episodes of censorship, but against the fundamental logic that has governed it in America for a century. So thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you. I did find myself thinking during that, it must be interesting being him at a cocktail party. It's like, what do you do? I'm an obscenity expert. But thank you for that. Laurie Halse Anderson. Laurie, it's good to see you in real life. This is the first time we're actually meeting in real life, but we had a remarkable conversation on television some months ago. Laurie Halse Anderson is a New York Times bestseller. She doesn't need an introduction to you, but she's a best-selling author known for tackling tough subjects with humor and sensitivity. 2 of her books, Speak and Chains, were National Book Award finalists. 2 more books, The Impossible Knife of Memory and Shout, were longlisted for the National Book Awards. Laurie's great honor is being a 7-time nominee for Sweden's Astrid Lindgren Memorial Award. The American Library Association gave Laurie a Margaret A. Edwards Award for her significant contribution to young adult literature, and she has been honored for her battles for intellectual freedom by the National Coalition Against Censorship and the National Council of Teachers of English. She's also a member of RAIN's National Leadership Council and frequently speaks about sexual violence. Laurie, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
You cover some of the issues that get people banned and challenged today, except you've been doing it for a really long time. And I was curious when I first spoke to you, and I'm curious now. It's a mission. You're getting all these awards. You're getting all this recognition for being a leader in this space. But your books aren't about being a leader in the space. They're telling stories that you believe people need to hear.
I think that what I try to do in my books is to write stories that reflect the experiences that my readers are going through. One of the strongest memories I have about being a kid and a teenager is just the constant sense of confusion. Because our children can see the hypocrisy. We tell them one thing and then we do another, and the world is not fair. I think that's one of the things I adore about kids and teenagers so much. They remind us what fair is. And then we kind of we settle as we age, and as we get used to the systems, we become the systems, heaven forbid. So I'm not writing anything that hasn't been lived and isn't being lived out on a daily basis.
Tell me about this, where you are in this journey right now. What's different to you from for instance, Speak, which it was challenged very early on and repeatedly.
Yes, yes.
And is it obvious to you why? I mean, we've really had all these reasons about, they're so similar, all the reasons that our colleagues here on the stage have talked about. Whether you call it prudishness or history that you don't want people to know, or control and maintenance of the patriarchy, or whatever it is, they're all the same thing. It's a control and power issue.
I would add one thing to that. I see two types of censorship. I see the censorship that traditionally I've experienced, which is when my books are being pulled or challenged because a parent or guardian is uncomfortable with the book. What they've said about Speak, and for those of you who don't know, Speak is a novel about a 9th grade girl who was raped a few weeks before 9th grade started, and she doesn't tell anybody. And so we go through her 9th grade year and she's a lovely, snarky teenager, in a lot of pain and broken because of her trauma. And the entire year for her leads up to the moment where she finds the courage to speak up about what's bothering her. And so when parents have brought challenges, what's nice is that they have to fill out paperwork. Yes. Data, we have data points. And they say things like, well, I don't want my kid to read this because I don't want them to be exposed to this thing called sexual violence, which is the parent's way of saying, I don't know how to talk to my children about sexual violence. I don't know how to talk to my children about sexuality. But what we're seeing differently, this is really important, is in this past year, we're seeing coordinated censorship attacks that is funded by dark money groups, that is coordinated by political action committees across the country, that take these fears of parents, and anyone who's raised a kid has been afraid because the world is scary. And often we weren't talked to when we were children about things like sexuality, about things like people whose gender identity or orientation may be different than ours, about the history of race in the United States. And so some parents, instead of leaning into the opportunity to learn and to support their child as they learn, want to just shut down the conversation. So that, to me, is sort of garden variety censorship. But this political manipulation of those parents' regular fears is the most cynical, sinful, obscene, anti-democratic bullshit I have ever seen as an American.
Well said. So, setting aside the bullshit for a second, let's go to the other one, the garden variety version of it. And I'm thinking back to All Boys Aren't Blue.
Yeah.
Queer, black author.
Yes.
And I ask all of my authors on my show, do you understand or can you empathize with anybody who doesn't want their kids to read this book? And I'm always surprised that in most cases, the answer is actually somewhat positive. Meaning people do understand why a parent would have putting aside the dark money, cynical bullshit, why a parent would actually may have some issue with their child being subject to this. And Dr. Strub, I have to ask you about that, because what the author told me in that particular instance was, but this thing that I'm writing about happens to people, just like you talked about. It happens. And if there's no book about it and no one has that experience, I've had authors tell me that kids have written them emails saying, you saved my life. I would have killed myself, but for the fact that I read in print what I had gone through. Tell me about that, to deal with Laurie's one column of censorship, perhaps the less evil version of it.
Sure, really briefly, I think when pornography becomes sex education, it's quite detrimental to children. They need some of this sexually explicit material, in these, age-appropriate YA kind of novels, because they are interested in sex, and they're either going to read it in these novels that are getting banned, or they're going to look at Pornhub. And, you know, it's much healthier to have them, you know, pursue their interests and their curiosities and their desires, you know, in these settings that are affirmative and educational and safer and, you know, and also kind of edgy at times. But, you know, if you censor that, it's not like those curiosities are going to go away, right? I mean, we know that historically. And so, you know, regardless of how uncomfortable parents might be, you know, you simply can't tell teenagers to stop developing sexually. And that's part of, I think, the corollary of what they're trying to do here. But, I mean, I defer to you.
No, I think you're right. It's, you know, it's interesting. I think it's important to focus on our responsibilities as adults to our children. Not just our own children, but to the next generation coming up. We are the village that is allegedly, poor kids, supposed to lead them into their own position of authority and power. Childhood is about learning to recognize the world. Adolescence is about learning the harder things. And even small children are exposed to hard things. But when we look at the body, at least in Western literature, we see authors trying to write towards the developmentally appropriate story for kids about these hard things. As a parent, if you are not willing to tackle conversations about hard things with your children, you are failing your children. And as a society, as communities, as school districts, if we are not willing to put a variety of books with all broad representation in our libraries and in our classrooms, we are, as a community, are committing educational malpractice.
Dr. Griffin, let's talk about the other side, the other column, the cynical, dark money-fueled banning. When André de Shields came up here, he introduced himself as critical race theory. It is, boy, with 1619 and actually, beloved, there are all these criticisms about makes my kids uncomfortable, makes my kids feel responsible for something they didn't do. I never had slaves. Talk to me a little about that category, which it may be on an individual basis true, but it's taken on a whole new life, right? This whole idea of don't make anybody's kids uncomfortable about ills of the past because that's just not good.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I think that one of the things, you know, going back to Morrison, who remains my teacher, is that she was a fierce defender of Huckleberry Finn.
Right.
And you might remember that oftentimes it's African-American parents who say, I don't want that book taught because it uses the N-word so much and it makes my children uncomfortable. And, you know, she then says, this is why we have to teach it. And so I think on the side of parents, every time I hear parents say something makes their young people uncomfortable, as a teacher, I'm excited because that's exactly the moment that I want to, let's turn to that page, let's talk about it. It's a teaching moment. You know, on the other side, the cynical side, the sort of manipulation of these fears, which are real fears, and people are very concerned about what they expose their children to, and ultimately parents do get to determine what their children read. But the political side is not trying to do away with the fear, it's trying to manipulate the fear. And race and gender and sexuality, those are fault lines that have existed in our society since the very beginning, and they know they're cynical, they are manipulative, and they aren't, rarely are they really about the books. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I always say is that people who read books do not ban them. They disagree with them, they engage with them, they argue with them, they're enlightened, they love them, they hate them. They don't ban them. And so usually it's a sign when some governmental entity is involved in wanting to ban a book, it's not even about the book, right? It's about something else, and it's about a manipulation of our fears, and again, as we've been saying, about kind of controlled and authoritarianism.
Right, we find as we curate the banned book list that it is a combination of the writer, the words, or the ideas.
Right.
Sometimes it's all three.
Right.
Sometimes it's just one. I've featured some authors from overseas where it's the writer.
Yeah.
It's you have a political view we don't like, and you're getting banned for it. And in many cases, these bans are not imposed by people who have read the book.
Oh no, there's no, and also the kind of easy dismissal of everything as critical race theory. When I hear people say that, I know they don't know what critical race theory is.
Right. Dr. Werbel, you said something that was really interesting to me, because I have been, in the last several months, like everybody else in America, consumed with the fall of Roe and its implications. But what I have learned that I did not know beforehand was the medieval nature of the opposition to Roe v. Wade and abortion and women's control. One of my first earlier authors on the Banned Book Club was Margaret Atwood, who talked about the fact that she wrote this in 1985, The Handmaid's Tale, and back then people sort of laughed at her for saying, how can you possibly predict this is what's going to happen? And America's not going to be a theocracy. Right. Which is going to do this. You mentioned that Sanger went on to open America's first birth control clinic in Brownsville, Brooklyn in 1916.
Yeah.
These things are inextricably tied.
Oh, absolutely. I think that, in my research, I went back a lot to the theological beliefs of the early Congregationalists. It's a very progressive denomination now, but back in the day, it was sort of those early Puritans, and their attitude toward sexuality was extremely oppressive. I mean, in their reading of the Bible, Eve was born from Adam. She was subservient to him. She was responsible for the fall of man. And the first thing Adam and Eve do when they are thrown out of the Garden of Eden is they fashion aprons to cover their nudity because they are ashamed of their bodies. And so these central ideas are kind of woven into the theocratic notions of a combined church and state, which early on, Massachusetts is really a theocracy, Connecticut is a theocracy, and it takes, and those strains are still within our culture, and they develop into a really robust system of means of keeping women in their place. So women can't possibly see a penis because they would become prostitutes instantly. They might feel lust and they would be fallen. This was the line that kept women out of medical school, kept women out of art school. All of these systems, they were too frail. They couldn't endure the types of education and work. So that shut them out of economic and political opportunities. And if you think about the birth control movement and the suffrage movement come together right around that time, 1915, when Comstock dies, and I think activists are really energized by that. But they start to see that if women are going to be able to make progress on any front of their lives, they need the vote. They need to be fully enfranchised in order to, open the doors to everything that's been closed off to them on the basis of these earlier theocratic ideas. And I think that, again, sometimes we forget, we are supposed to have the separation of church and state. Mm-hmm. And these things need to be called out as theological. It is not the natural order of the world. It is not a standard trope of every religion that woman was born from man and is responsible for the fall of mankind. That's a very specific theological reading. And if I could just make a pitch for anything, it's, that we all go out and remind people of the importance of freedom of expression, as people have already discussed, things you like and things you don't like. Because if you decide that you're gonna, advocate for banning the things you don't like, just wait, it'll come around, and that's what's happening right now. And so we need to support the idea of pluralism, that everyone's religion is okay in America, and that everyone has equal opportunity to express their ideas and their feelings about gender and sexuality. So this all goes way back, as everyone's been talking about, and I think it's important to understand how deep these roots are.
So you just said a word that I think about a lot, pluralism. Dr. Strub, part of this whole thing, and it sort of centers on a lot of the stuff you were talking about, the way in which we have just tried to stop certain things from being seen and understood. It's anti-pluralistic, right? It's the idea that we are not better for understanding our differences, and we live in a world where we talk about tolerance, and I've been sort of saying to myself, I think it's a nonsensical term, because our society is not going to get richer on the basis of tolerance. It's going to get richer on the basis of pluralism. Not me putting up with your weird lifestyle. It's me understanding that you have an entirely different view of life and life experience than I do, and I'm richer for the fact that you're in my midst, and neither of us are going to jail for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, to speak to kind of some folks on the panel have already addressed the kind of dark money political organizing around this. I mean, every one of these movements is exactly that. It's a rearguard action against new forms of diversity in our society.
Right.
So whether it's Moms for Liberty, whether, it's the Tea Party before that, the Moral Majority before that, Save Our Children, Citizens for Decent Literature, the Society for the Suppression of Vice. I mean, these are one iteration after another of the exact same impulse, which I think, Amy was just talking about, this impulse toward a white, heterosexual, patriarchal, Christian America. And they're never effective. I mean, that's the bitter irony of it all. It never works. It fails every single time, but not without leaving a sort of trail of destruction in its wake. And so, yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that's the historical framework through which we should understand this as, part of this larger effort to basically, squash diversity and pluralism in our society.
So I worry about that statement you just made, that it never works, because on this anniversary of Banned Books Week, I'm fearful, Dr. Griffin, that some of this might be working. Now, you all have the benefit of having read and studied history, and I hope you're all right that it doesn't work. But Dr. Griffin, I am a little, I have to say, I lose sleep over this.
Well, so do I. I mean, I think that, we do feel, and I think most Americans right now feel that we are on the precipice of something that's quite dangerous, that democracy is under threat, and that book banning, these kinds of conversations about censorship and book banning are just evidence of that. They're one symptom of that. I think that they don't work. They work to the extent that they cause great harm, that politicians do get elected on them, and those are politicians who go and create policies or Supreme Court decisions that impact our lives in dangerous ways. The ways that they don't work is exactly what you said about what you confronted in Iran, is that human expression doesn't stop, right? The distribution of it, our access to it, that gets challenged, but it's as much, it's like breathing air. Writers are going to write, artists are going to paint. So it doesn't win in the long run because people are going to continue to produce that work. Now, will we continue to have access to it? That's up to us. That's our obligation and our responsibility.
Right, our duty is to make sure it's available in the New York Public Library and libraries around.
And that libraries are around, and librarians
Yeah.
aren't threatened for doing what they do.
I've got some remarkable questions from the audience, and I'd like to go to them a few minutes early because I want to hear from all of you and the great questions you've got. Laurie, this one is for you. I'm an English teacher at a high school in the Bronx. How can I teach books about sexual assault without triggering or creating discomfort for sexual assault survivors?
To that teacher, bless you for that question and that sensitivity. You're going to have sexual assault survivors in your class whether you teach the book or not. I think it's very appropriate when you're introducing any book to students to think about what content in that book might be a cause of pain for someone in the class whose story you don't know. So I think opening up a discussion with I hate the word trigger warning, y'all, because triggers, that's just a moment of concern or just a heads up. And I think that if, how when you're a teenager and you have a problem, but you don't want to admit it, so you say, I have this friend, right? So that's how you can communicate with your students. When you're communicating a book like Speak, you have to, I believe, if I got to be the queen, also communicate ways that people can get help. That means giving them information about RAINN, RAINN.org, the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. Also 1in6.org, which is an organization for male survivors of sexual violence and abuse. Don't just be thinking about the girls in your class, because the males and the people who identify outside that binary can also be victims. And you are going to also have students in your classroom who have committed acts of sexual violence. And it's very, very important to think about their needs, how they got there, and how you can prevent them from going forward. So I appreciate your sensitivity, and I think you need to be talking to your colleagues and make sure that you have a place to talk to about the experiences you're about to have in your classroom. but recognize that you not only are going to save lives by teaching my book, and there are plenty of other great books that talk about human sexuality and sexual violence in particular, but you will be affecting generations of families. Because when our kids have to experience trauma as children or as adolescents, and their trauma is not cared for and is not, they're not supported, what we know from generations of really smart psychiatrists looking at that is that that trauma gets passed on to their own children, and then it gets passed on to their own children. We know that story is the vehicle that traditionally we have used for as long as we've been gathering around bonfires, to pass on our wisdom, our morality, our compass, and our hope. So you're making the right choice.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And, you know, after you and I talked on TV, we put up the phone number for RAIN, but it has been on more than one occasion I haven't had an author share with us information in which somebody, it may have saved a life.
Absolutely.
At least one that they know of, and
Yep.
who knows beyond that.
Yep.
Is there anything, Dr. Werbel, that you think should be banned?
Oh, wow. Well, obviously, child pornography. I mean, if a person can't legally consent to having their image shared, or I mean, obviously, and this is where we get into the special category of children. Mm-hmm. They do not have the ability to consent, and of course, as a parent myself, we worry so much all the time. Yeah, absolutely. There are things that are banned now. I mean, I mean, Whitney could go through much better than I can all of the categories of, incitement to violence. I mean, there's a big one, right? As I mentioned, child pornography. But we have carve-outs in our speech laws now that I think are robust enough. Adding in these state laws about, discomfort and, critical race theory, which is just such nonsense, I think I'm hoping anyway that when these laws are challenged, and many of you in the room might be bringing those lawsuits, I mean, certainly the PEN America is on this, I mean, that they will be struck down as unconstitutional. I mean, at least I'm hoping that.
I just received a question from the audience that actually expands on this question, Dr. Griffin, and I'd like to ask it to you. Historian of the White Power movement, Kathleen Bellew, has discussed her pedagogical practices of when and whether to assign white supremacist manifestos to understand these movements via primary sources. In the summer of 2020, many stores and websites removed such manifestos from circulation for their role in inciting anti-black racial terrorism. How might we think about contemporary book bans enough to distinguish between book bans and deplatforming? I thank you for that question. That's a lot of ideas in a few words.
It is a lot. I mean, no, it's a very important question, and I think about this often. I err on the side of not banning even those materials, because I think that access to them can lead to violence and can be used to organize violence, as we know, and when they're used in propagandistic means. But I think we have to understand them as well. And so I would not ban them, for instance, in a classroom where they can be taught critically, where a teacher who is well trained to provide context can teach them alongside materials written by people who have been victimized by those same kinds of movements. So I do think, yes, deplatforming them, some of the things that we've seen on the deep web, in the last few years, especially where we've seen kind of young people radicalized, taught out of context, taught racist propaganda is one thing, but having access to documents and materials that we can study together and critically think about what leads someone to think about their fellow human being in this way, I think that it is utmost importance that we have access and that we continue to confront them together.
Yeah, I would say of the books that we've covered on our banned book club, Huckleberry Finn was actually the most controversial on that one, because I got yays and nays from all quarters on that one but the idea of we must read things that we sometimes are uncomfortable with or don't see the need to understand them. Laurie, I want to ask you this because you first made the comment about the cynical coordinated forces behind this current wave of book banning. What's the political opportunity that they're trying to capitalize on? I mean, it may be obvious it's control, but what do you think's going on right now?
Well, as a nation, we've come through some of the most difficult years in our history, and I think people are exhausted. We're all traumatized to some extent by the last couple of years, and it's when people are tired and afraid, it's easier to make them a little bit more afraid and a little bit more afraid. They're creating a problem, and then they're going to put themselves in the position of solving the problem. So you take the normal, natural fears that parents and guardians have for their kids, and you give them false information. Instead of reading the entire book as a whole, as we're told to do, you pull out those pictures in a graphic novel or that paragraph, 134 in Speak, by the way. That's the page number. And as a preacher's daughter, I have to point out, follow that up and say, there are some lines in the Bible that if one pulled out of context that you would be horrified by too. But yeah, so you make them afraid, and then you've got them in your, not only do you have their votes, but then they open their wallets to you.
Well, there's entire parallels in the rest of the political universe for that right now, so it shouldn't surprise us that it extends to books. But, Professor Strub, another question from the audience, why is this not discussed more? Why is there not a bigger outcry? Obviously, this crowd understands this, and everybody listening to us online understands this. I'm not sure it's as big as it should be.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, I do think one of the sort of masterful organizational and strategic moves of these groups like Moms for Liberty is, I mean, the action is at the grassroots local level, right? I mean, it's not necessarily visible unless the national media sort of consolidates these stories and reports on them, because a school board meeting in Woodbridge, New Jersey, or North Hunterton, New Jersey, is just not that exciting and newsworthy. There'll be a local news report on it, but that does allow it to fly under the surface.
Until somebody yells and screams and it makes it to
national
news.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I will say, I mean, as somebody who's completely politically opposed to all of the work these, right-wing pro-censorship groups are doing, I mean, you do have to commend them for their strategic insights on this, right? I mean, they understand free speech in some ways, I think, better than some of the civil libertarian framework. I mean, one of the big mistakes that, I'm a card-carrying member of the ACLU. I think it's one of the most important organizations in America, but I think it made a strategic decision in the 1920s to commit to a vision of free speech as battles in the, quote, marketplace of ideas. And that historically does not actually describe how any of this has ever worked. I mean, it has always been a contested public sphere. I mean, the idea that free speech emerged out of the class struggle. As a proud member of the Democratic Socialists of America, I have to shout out the socialists, anarchists, and pacifists of the World War I era, who, they had no interest in these abstract notions of free speech. For them, this was the class struggle. The First Amendment mattered insofar as it supported radicalism and the labor movement. And that legacy, I think, is better understood by Moms for Liberty than it is by, the ACLU organizationally, to its great detriment. I mean, the ACLU ended up on the wrong side of Citizens United, in my opinion, and that's obviously a bit of a tangent I won't go on a rant about. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I do think that does speak to their kind of organizational muscle, basically. I mean, these grassroots struggles are going on, and it's hard to see them.
Dr. Werbel, one of the things that Laurie commented on is that when people go to ban or challenge a book, there's some paperwork involved. I have a question from the audience, and I think it's rhetorical, but is there a way to at least require that members of a group that you were just talking about, groups like this, read the book before they try and ban it?
Well, I mean, the First Amendment jurisprudence is that things are supposed to be considered as a whole. So certainly, juries, if it comes to that, are supposed to read the whole book and think about the context. I was thinking about actually local journalism, this idea, and I'm a proud former school board member, I'll say, and to the extent that our meetings were covered by a very local newspaper, that newspaper's on its last legs at this point. And so I think that that we need to support in every place, in every way possible, forums for having these very difficult conversations. And we need to prepare our young people to have these very difficult conversations. It's not like if you ban the white supremacist manifesto or the book that discusses rape, that those things will go away. But what's really scary is that your kid could encounter a white supremacist manifesto on the internet and think it's sort of factual because they have no critical thinking apparatus. These things need to be done carefully, and so in every way possible, supporting educators at every level, pre-K through university, rebuilding faith and trust and respect for our teachers, especially our K-12 teachers, and the value of expertise that comes from especially educators who think about how to have these, how to frame these conversations so that students are learning ways to analyze information. And then we need the press to be robust and vibrant and covering every aspect of our society so we have facts to talk about and not just these like pithy, spun, ready for Twitter and Instagram, soundbite statements that take complicated and nuanced subjects and just turn them into sort of, political, screeds. So, all these things, I think we can see what it is that we need to rejuvenate and rebuild and strengthen. And hopefully now that I'm hoping the pandemic, obviously we all are, is sort of coming to an end, that we can really get out there again, speak with our neighbors, and rebuild our sense of a community that can discuss even the hardest things and learn from each other.
That's democracy.
That's democracy.
That's as good a place as we're going to get to end this, and I don't want to. The conversation shouldn't end. But I think you've all made some reference to the fact that this is about the struggle for democracy that we're in right now. It probably always has been, but it feels particularly urgent and poignant right now. So thank you for the work that you have done. Thank you for coming here and participating in this discussion. Thank you for reading. Thank you for supporting authors. The one remarkably subversive thing about having a banned book club is that it's just a great middle finger for anybody who wants to ban a book, because I think there are people who curate their entire reading list now around banned books, and it's showing up in sections of bookstores and libraries, and I think that's tremendous. I want to give a very deep, heartfelt thank you to PEN America, to the beautiful New York Public Library, libraries everywhere, to our partner organization, the American Historical Association. I want to give a thanks to Flashpoint's funder, the National Endowment for the Humanities. A thank you to all of our panelists and André, Critical Race Theory DeShields, for his can't even call it a reading. I don't know what that is he did, but that was amazing, for his heart, really, that he brought to this evening. But again, thank you to you. You are the ones who are going to save this. You're the ones who are going to go to your school board meetings, and you're going to run for office, and you're going to show up and vote, and you're going to make sure somebody's registered to vote. You're going to stay on top of this thing. You're going to buy these books. You're going to go to your libraries, and you're going to take these books out. This is not for a panel of speakers to save. This is for you to save, and you are doing it, and your showing up tonight proves that #FreeTheBooks will prevail. Thank you.